people waving to make sure to interrupt me. So,
Sorry.
well, we had a question after
That's
last week's session, and I can't remember who, Jimmy, you told me asked this about, as we talk about trying to care for the true self, for who we are really inside, made in the image of God. At what point, how do you know the difference between working on yourself in a spiritual way and when are you being selfish? So I don't remember who asked that question, but whoever it was, thank you. It's a good question. I grew up in a spiritual tradition, conservative, evangelical, that, somehow I picked up the idea that caring and focusing on myself was selfish. And even though as a minister, I've been required to go to countless seminars and workshops on caring for yourself and preventing burnout, and self-care has become sort of a catchphrase in today's society. I have to confess, I've never been good at self-care. Deep down, I still have this idea that it's more noble to sacrifice yourself, to give of yourself, to serve other people. And that is noble. But if you're not caring for yourself, it's not sustainable. And I've had to come to terms with the idea that when we are not caring for ourselves, that's sort of its own form of selfishness, sort of wrapped in, in a twisted way of this lie that we're supposed to somehow have it all together and pour ourselves out till our cup is empty. And because it's an ego thing, it's in its own way, the ego loves to twist things and make it all about us in really unhelpful ways. And, tells us things like we're noble or we're better, or we hold ourselves to a different standard than we hold other people to, out of a sense of wanting to justify ourselves and vindicate ourselves. And the simple truth is, if we are not able to make rest a part of our schedule, if we are not able to take time to find fun and pleasure, then we run out of energy and we deplete ourselves and we become unable to care for other people. We become unable to be present with other people in the moment because we're so worn down that we are unable to take any notice of anyone around us because we're so depleted. And especially, we understand this as we age, and I'm beginning really to understand it at middle age, which is physically our bodies begin to not compensate for our lack of self-care. And so when we don't exercise, when we don't eat well, just at a certain point, we begin to lose our muscle mass and our strength, and we have to exercise and work at maintaining our ability to keep going and to have energy. When we were younger, we could just go and go, many of us. But as we age, we learn it is a necessity if we want to remain active in our professions, or if we're retired, to remain active in our retirement, or to be present for our adult children and our grandchildren, if we have them, that we, as a matter of course, must do all the things our doctors always told us to do that we never did, some of us, like me, along the way. And so self-care becomes a discipline that enables us to care for other people. And a part of that spiritual journey is learning to be who we truly are and not be someone else, to be who we were created to be, our true self that's down in us, who we were born as, instead of the masks we've learned to put on in order to survive or to achieve. And because I think everybody in this group has lived long enough probably to have experienced moments of burnout. And burnout, is suffering, but it's actually it's a disguised gift, because it's all the symbols and signifiers that we're born with that tell us, hey, what you're doing isn't working. What you're doing is not sustainable. How you've been doing it is not bringing joy to your life or meaning or purpose or fulfillment. Rather, you are exhausting yourself and you are no longer truly living. And this is why, spiritual writers talk about when we are present with other people in ways that are unfaithful to who we truly are, that we are harming other people. And Parker Palmer, who I referenced last week, puts it this way. If you may have heard of the Sufi, the Muslim Sufi, the mystical part of Islam, there's a poet called Rumi, R-U-M-I. And a lot of people who are of other faiths, such as Christians, find a lot of meaning in what Rumi has written. And Rumi wrote in a poem, he said, if you are here unfaithfully with us, you're causing terrible damage. And what Palmer takes that to mean is that when we are unfaithful to our true selves, we will extract a price from those around us. We will make promises we can't keep. We'll build houses, spiritually speaking, from flimsy stuff. We'll conjure dreams that devolve into nightmares, and other people will suffer when we are not being authentically ourselves. And giving you a very mundane example of this, all right, I've spent my professional career as a minister in churches and in nonprofit work, and what they all seem to demand and require are getting volunteers to serve for a project or to be on a committee or a board. And what I've discovered is, well, the truth is most people don't want to do that anymore. And so, as I go around trying to find people to volunteer for and fill slots, I have been guilty of often taking a yes from people who don't know how to say no. They really don't want to do it, but they feel obligated and maybe guilty or ashamed to say no. And so they say yes, but their heart really isn't in it. And so they show up to volunteer and their energy or lack of energy shows. They serve on a committee and they remain silent and they don't contribute, and they kind of try to hide and let other people take the lead and participate. And they kind of clock in and clock out, and sort of suck the life out of things. Or there are people who maybe don't say yes, but they still don't really say no. And I've taken that for a good enough, you're filling this slot for this committee or this board. And what the result is that you get a group of people that it would have been much better if they had just known themselves well enough, been confident in themselves, and been able to say, no, that's not a fit for me. I'm going to say no, and to do it honestly and graciously. And because what I've experienced more often than not in having volunteer committees and boards and groups is a group of people that don't really want to be there. They're there out of obligation, guilt, or shame. And so the energy they provide actually sort of does more harm than good. And so a way of thinking about, knowing yourself, knowing what brings you life, knowing what you can bring energy to and joy to, and even though it might not be quote unquote fun, and doing that rather than other things which you do out of obligation, or maybe at different times we do to pad our resume or to make other people think well of us, actually hurts the cause, because you're holding a spot that someone who could bring more joy to it and more energy to it could fill. And the ego says, and man, I have been guilty of this, says, if you don't do it, who will? No one else will do it. And I feel like, when the ego says that, God sort of laughs and says, oh, you think you're the center of the world, and you believe that if you aren't the savior for everybody, then, it's all lost. And guess what? You were never the savior in the first place. That job is already taken. And I can make use of all kinds of different people. And what we discover is some of the things, especially in churches, and boy, we're discovering it right now thanks to COVID, is
what happened?
Lost.
Everybody's muted, Jimmy. You're muted, Jimmy. Unmute. No.
sorry about that. I got a call and I tried to X out the call and it kicked me out of the Zoom. So anyway, what I was just going to say about churches is we're discovering that there are a lot of things we've done out of obligation or because they've been done before that maybe we don't really enjoy or don't bring us life, don't draw us closer to God. They just make us more busy and not more faithful Christians. And, and maybe some things, if they were meaningful once upon a time, aren't meaningful anymore. And, by perpetuating saying yes and showing up and feeling bad because we aren't doing anything, we're actually creating an obstacle to God ending something that needs to end, and God and giving us the energy to start something new that needs to begin. And so taking care of ourselves spiritually, I look at the way we determine whether we're being selfish or we're genuinely caring for ourselves is, Jesus said, you shall know them by their fruit. When we're caring for ourselves, if it makes us more narcissistic and more cut off from the needs of the world, and we become insufferable, bores, then sorry, that was a dog yelp, then we're not doing it right, but if it provides us with more energy, more ability to be present with other people, to care for other people, then we're probably doing it right. So I hope that answers that really important question. Does anybody have a reaction to that?
I think one of the things I've always thought about, Chase, is, when you have life choices, and I'll just put the ministers on the box for this. In many churches, ministers are moved around, and ministers have obviously tended to the flock. They're called to do 10 funerals a week, all this stuff happening. And it's a giving of oneself for perhaps God's calling. But on the other hand, that choice brings suffering on other ends. A lot of ministers' families are often neglected. So one can make personal choices, and especially when a minister's, told, all right, you're going to move from vibrant New York to the boondocks of Alabama. I didn't say Kansas. And
Right.
yes, there's people to be tended there, but now your kids are pulled out of high school, the family can suffer, and you earnestly believe it's God's calling, but your choice is affecting others in a very tough way that don't have the same calling as you. And I think all of us have those choices sometimes with jobs, with things that we do. And that's the real battle, is, God will have to take care of those who your choices have made a difficult life for, in a sense, but it's a problem.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate your sympathy for clergy, because that can be true, but it's especially true in what we call the caring professions, so-called doctors, nurses, therapists, counselors, all the kind of people that can experience burnout where they don't take care of themselves. But I also think that, like, in any job, even if you don't have a job, when, so to speak, professionally, being a so-called stay-at-home parent is a job. Caregiving for, aging parents or a loved one. And sorry if you hear whining, I have a very needy dog with me right now. My wife, he is dependent on my wife in a very codependent way, and she's out of town. And so he's coming wanting attention. But we can reach a point where we have given so much out that we don't have anything left in. And so it's makes a certain logical sense of economics, of you can't give what you don't possess. But again, the ego says to us that we're different, we're better, or maybe we don't deserve that kind of self-care. And so we have to really be, careful of those kind of ego traps. So anybody else have a reaction to? All right, Snuggles. Gosh, all right. Well, I'll go on, and I had a subject from last week's session that I think is really important, and it has to do, we didn't get to it, and it's a rather immense topic. It's about suffering, and the question of how do we respond to God when we experience suffering in our lives? The wilderness moments that we experience can be caused by circumstances external to us that are genuine suffering, loss, of all kinds, illness of various kinds. Our very first session, Margot said something that I was so grateful for, that I thought, when Margot said this, I was like, yes, somebody said it, because it's so honest and true. and Margot's probably blushing right now. I don't have you on my screen, but the Margot described after experiencing loss of the death of her children, two of her children, that she was angry with God. And why I feel like that is so important to express is because many of us absorbed religious messages in our upbringings to say everything happens for a reason, everything is God's will. To doubt or to question God is wrong. And certainly to be angry at God is wrong, because who are you to be angry at God? But the simple truth is, if you open up the Bible and bother to actually read it, it's amazing what you discover when one actually opens up the Bible and finds out what's in it. People are angry with God all the time in the Bible, very angry with God. People express questions and doubts and rail against the unfairness of their circumstances all the time in the Bible. Paul does it, even Jesus does it. When you open up the book of Psalms, the most common type of psalm, these songs of poetry of addressing God, are not praise psalms. They are lament psalms. We have the book of Job, which is a long treatise on suffering and undeserved suffering. And it's really more of a study of all the wrong things to say when you're talking with someone who's suffering. You have the book of Ecclesiastes, which basically concludes nothing matters in this life. I mean, when you read Ecclesiastes, it is bleak, buddy. I mean, it does not conform to, most of what passes for American Christianity these days. If, Ecclesiastes basically says everything is vanity and it's all pointless. Pretty bleak. The prophets at times rail against God for what they say is unjust treatment, where God has gone back on what God has promised. And the book of Lamentations is just a book of lamenting the destruction of Israel and the experience of the exile that we talked about last week. And so Scripture endorses the idea that when we suffer, it is appropriate, yea, it is even biblical, for us to express our anger, express our questions, our doubt, to rail at God, to even accuse God of being unfaithful. That we have all the warrant we need in the Bible, more than we need. We have every permission to go off on God. And, and if you think about it, this sort of makes sense. You may have heard the expression that says the opposite of love is not hate or anger. The opposite of love is indifference. That a part of our loving of God is the idea that our anger at God, our questioning God, our doubts about God's existence, all are, interactions and refusing to be indifferent to God. And so the idea of lament, of crying out to God, is, from a biblical point of view, a very appropriate action in our spiritual lives. But yet, in Western Christianity, for the most part, we have no experience and no practice of lamenting in our worship, in our spiritual devotions. Whereas if you go, to the Middle East, if you go to, a lot of parts of Eastern Christianity, and I would say the exception in Western Christianity is really African-American Christianity. If you've ever been to a funeral at an African-American church, there is wailing and emotion like most of us white people, would never want to happen in church, and it is understood that a part of it of the grief process is the emotional, just letting it all out because you're hurting so much. And so as we talk for a bit, I'm wondering if anyone would be brave enough, as Margot was brave in our first session, if anyone has an experience like that in their journey that they would want to share about, where they were able to express anger and emotion at God in the midst of their struggles. If someone does along the way, speak up and interrupt me, because I think it's meaningful to hear. When we talk about the idea of lament, what we're wrestling with is what theologians have a term for this. It's theodicy, theodicy, theodicy. And it comes across, you may have experienced this in, reading, or I'm sure Jimmy has mentioned it in sermons. I know he has, because I've read them, that the idea of theodicy is trying to reconcile truths and beliefs that really don't reconcile. And they are beliefs about God and reality, and there are 4 of them in most of the time, the way it's formulated. One is God is all powerful. 2 is God is all knowing. 3 is God is loving. And the 4th part is suffering exists. If God is all powerful and all knowing and also loving, then why does God allow suffering? Especially suffering that we feel we or others whom we love don't deserve. Or even we read the news or watch the news and look at horrible suffering around the world and say, if there's a God, why does God allow this? If God can do something about it, and God knows about it, and God supposedly loves us, why does God allow it? And I have to confess, as a minister, like I've found my own way to sort of reconcile how these truths fit together, enough for me to still remain a Christian who believes in God. But in a pastoral situation where I'm talking with someone who's experiencing suffering, I would never break out my theological explanation of theodicy. I would deservedly be smacked by someone or accused of being insensitive and uncaring. Because when you're suffering, is not the time for somebody to give you a theological explanation. It's the time to be quiet, for other people to be quiet and to listen and to be present with you while you suffer. And the reason lament is so important is because it is honest and it acknowledges the suffering is real, and it doesn't try to explain it away. or minimize it. Because let's face it, oftentimes when we're with someone who's experiencing suffering, we want to come up with an explanation for it so we don't have to deal with our own discomfort with their pain. And the truth is, every person has to find their own way to reconcile. If they say they believe in God and experience a relationship with God, they have to find their own way to reconcile their experience of suffering with that God. And what one person may find comfort in, another person might say that's total BS, and vice versa. And so the good news is that when we open our Bibles, we are not the first people to wrestle with these things. Even predating the Bible, predating, the Israelites and Hebrews, some of the oldest texts in human existence are literally ancient Sumerian texts that are basically saying, hey, God of mine, why did you allow this terrible thing to happen to me? It's as old as humanity. And lament enables us to ask these questions. And let me stop there. Does anybody have a reaction, or maybe wants to share experience on their own journey of the anger or the questioning of God?
Chase, there was a very apropos article in the New York Times this week. A woman, she's now 32, 10 years ago, had a form of cancer. I'll just say leukemia. And 10 years ago, the treatment was almost as worse as a disease. And she went into this thing about isolation, the chemotherapy, she couldn't see people, comparing it to COVID today and how people had to do that. Well, her cancer has come back. And she actually mentioned the word wilderness. When you're in the wilderness of this treatment, and she said it actually, there's two paths. One is the woe is me path. She goes, but she found the path that actually brought her closer to God, because she really needed his support with the isolation she faced, through that session of woe is me. It actually brought her a stronger faith. And she said, when you go into those wilderness times and you have to hit bottom, it really brings out, as you have said, who you are and how you're going to have that relationship or not. So I don't believe in coincidences. It literally, came, and and she's formed a whole community, and I can't remember what its name. It's called like Isolation Theory or something. And she's got 100,000 followers now talking about this, when you feel isolated and what to do.
Wow, I need to look for that article. Thank you for that. That sounds great.
I'll send you the link if I can, because I recycled the paper before I saved it. But I went online and I went into isolation and a March 2022 New York Times article in it, and it brought her name up. So I'll send it to you.
That's great. Thank you. Well,
Chase,
yeah.
this is Janet.
Hey, Janet.
I have found, I had profound faith. I don't know about whether it's had, I guess it's still there. But I have found that this, talking about the isolation, everybody knows what you should do. And you get all of these people who mean well, but they start talking over you when you are expressing some of the problems that you're having. And I have, with my best friend and my daughter-in-law, I have had to say, stop talking. Let me say what I have to say. Thank you for all of your thoughts of what I can do. I don't need that. I just need somebody to listen. And sometimes everybody knows what you can do, but it's not helpful.
Yeah.
I don't know what I'm saying, but anyway.
Well,
Yes.
what I hear from you is how important presence is. So much of what we speak to people who are hurting is about our own discomfort,
Mhm.
right? Rather than really trying to help them, we're trying to help ourselves.
Exactly.
What I mean when I say presence is being aware of yourself enough to stifle your tongue and really pay attention to the person or persons around you. And that takes a certain amount of spiritual health to be able to say, I don't need to speak in this moment. And my job is to be present with someone. And I think COVID really isolated us, and it really left us in need. And, and maybe part of the reason we talk over others so much is because we're so desperate, to talk ourselves. But like I said, when you read the book of Job, Job's friends show up, and the book of Job kind of like systematically goes through where his friends say all the usual stuff that you can say to try to comfort someone, from it's your fault because of sin to, who are you to question God? It's a mystery, all the different responses. And in the end, they're all proven inadequate, and what I find people desire more than anything is someone just to be present with them in, their pain. Like you said, shut up and listen to me. Let me talk. That's what I need most, And the spiritual lesson I take from it is that maybe on the spiritual journey, there are times when more than answers of why we are in the wilderness, we want presence. Rather than God giving us an answer, what we want is the presence of God. We want peace. We want comfort more than we want answers.
Chase,
Yeah.
Connie,
Hey, Gotti.
this is a very minor incident. It's not tragic, but I had to have some oral surgery recently. I had to take part of a tooth, and it's very unpleasant. Now I'm sitting in the chair saying, this is awful. I wish it hadn't happened. And I had this strong feeling of the presence of God and the message, I'm with you. You're not in this alone. It didn't make it any less uncomfortable, but it was very extremely comforting. And it didn't make me feel, oh, why did you let this happen? Why did you have the abscess in the tooth and so forth? But that God was there to support me in the difficulties of life, because life, all sorts of stuff happens in life, as we know. It just seems unrealistic that you want God to order this, like the TV show where everything is perfect and afterlife, but to help, to be that sense of someone of God being present with me was very powerful.
And what I hear in that, Connie, the word that came to mind was resilience. That experience of God being present enabled you to be resilient during your suffering, and if we have time, which we may not, where I was going to go in this session is talking about where Paul in 2 Corinthians chapter 12 talks about what he describes as a thorn in his flesh. You could also translate the word thorn as like a wooden stake, like the kind that soldiers use in a defense to entrap enemies. He's impaled, is the imagery he's using. And he describes praying 3 times for God to remove it and gets no answer. And then after 3 times, he hears God say to him, "My strength is made perfect in weakness. My grace is sufficient for you." And Paul understands that and describes it years later, and maybe not in the moment, but 14 years later, apparently, he describes it as him coming to understand that God, for whatever reason, was not going to remove that pain, but that God instead offers grace. And that somehow in our weakness, God's strength is revealed. And I want to be careful, and I don't want to make it a mathematical formula, because we're dealing with mysterious stuff. The Bible clearly points to the idea that, God is not a gumball machine or a vending machine where we put in a coin and we push a button and we get what we want. The Bible instead says, sometimes we get what we ask for, sometimes we don't. And why some people get, what they pray for and other people don't, seems often like a mystery. And even Jesus didn't get what he prayed for when he said, "May this cup be passed from me." And so, but that God can give us what some writers call a sustaining grace. Maybe not a healing grace, but a sustaining grace. And if you'll allow me for a moment, I want to talk about the idea of lament, because when you read these Psalms of lament, and you can, I don't have time to read them, but like you can Google Psalms of lament and they'll give you a list in your first Google hit, and you can read some of them. That most of them, not all of them, but most of them have the same parts. There's an opening address, usually, "O Lord." Then there's a description of whatever the problem is. And it can be anything from what seems to be a physical illness to enemies literally attacking. And then there's a request for God to help, and all the reasons why God should. And then at the very end, in almost all of them, in the last verse or two, suddenly the psalm changes, and the person in the psalm says, "I trust, God, that you're going to help me. And when you help me, I'm going to go, I'll praise you, and I'll go offer a sacrifice in the temple in honor of you." And I've always wondered, how can these psalms move from sometimes really biting, angry, addressing God and saying, "Where are you? Why have you let this happen to me? Why are you silent? Why aren't you present with me like you said you would be in my time of need?" Blistering anger. And then at the end, they kind of switch and go, "Oh God, I know you're going to help me get through this, and I'm going to praise you after it's done." And I always think, well, isn't that kind of dishonest? It doesn't go with the rest of it. Well, I read something recently which pointed out, what modern psychotherapy has taught us, right, is that a lot of meeting with a therapist or a counselor, a lot of that is just trying to get us to articulate our pain, right? That a lot of all that effort is trying to get at us actually verbalizing how much pain we're in, and to get past all the rationalizations and all the voices in our heads that say, you should have a stiff upper lip, or you need to be brave or set a good example, or you don't want to appear weak or vulnerable. Well, the Psalms knew this, 3,000 years ago, which is you just let it fly and you let it all out. And you can't get to a point, one can't, I can't, we can't get to a point of actually moving forward in any real sense of dealing with our suffering and pain until we have really let it out in a safe place with someone else who is able to take it. And once we let it out, there's a freedom that comes. Then we begin to get traction. Then we begin, to perhaps, hopefully, experience some sense of God's presence or grace. Then we can begin to experience the comfort of loved ones around us. But when we have bottled it up inside of us and told ourselves it's wrong to feel this way, well, we never get anywhere. And so this expulsion of lament, of anger, of, even at times seeming like bitterness. Some of the Psalms get really harsh. One of the Psalms, I think it's 147, is after the exile, literally says, I sat by the river in Babylon and wept. And the Babylonians said, sing us a song of Zion, but we hung up our harps on the willow tree and we sang songs no more. And it gets to this brutal point where it says, oh, how we wish the people that hurt us would themselves get hurt. And then it says something awful. It says, we wish their infants were taken and bashed in the head, which is horrific. Now, it's important to note that they don't say, I did go bash their infants in the head, or I'm going to make plans to go do that. They were expressing a place of someone who's been abused and wounded, a very abused place. And when we have experienced abuse, the desire for vengeance, the desire for the one who caused us pain to experience pain, that desire in itself is not wrong. And in fact, expressing that desire in a safe place with someone who knows how to handle it is a way for us to actually not act on the desire for vengeance. But, I've been with, women who've been abused by their husbands who expressed wishing, they could beat the crap out of the husband who abused them. And I didn't judge that. To me, it seemed entirely understandable, that they would feel that way. And when we have feelings like that, we're human, it's understandable. But getting it out in a place that's safe with someone who can handle it is how we deal with it. When we bottle it up inside of us, we eventually can't take it anymore, and we explode and we act out in all kinds of harmful ways to other people. But this gift of lament, is kind of what I heard Janet saying. And Janet, I don't mean to speak for you, but that desire to want to say to other people, just listen to me. I need to speak and get this out. Well, that's what lament is in Scripture. And, when Paul speaks about this message from God, of God expressing my grace is sufficient for you, that didn't come easily, nor did it come quickly. but it came out of a place of real pain, that thorn in the flesh. People speculate about what it is. We don't know, but it could have been a physical malady of all different kinds of illnesses or disabilities. It could have been actually opponents or enemies who were harming him. Either way, whatever it was, he spoke of God's grace, not in a trite way, not in a way of, oh, everything will be okay, pat, pat, pat on the shoulder. Everything happens for a reason. Or I hate it when people misquote the scripture that says God will not give you more than you can handle. That's actually misquoting a Bible verse. But Paul is speaking out of someone who's experienced real suffering, but nonetheless on the other side found that God had given him the grace of sustaining him. And this is where we get to verses that Paul uses elsewhere, where in Romans 8, Paul describes we reach a moment where we don't know how to pray. And in those moments, God is gracious enough that the Spirit intercedes for us and prays, that even in our moment where we don't even know what to say and we have no words, that somehow, in a way that doesn't really make sense to our minds, God's Spirit is taking up all our slack and praying for us. Or Paul says in Romans 5, this incredible verse, that again isn't a trite saying, but it's written by someone who has experienced deep pain, and suffering. He says, we will boast in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance or resilience, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope. And hope does not disappoint us because God's love has been poured into our hearts through the Holy Spirit. And so, Lillian Daniel is a United Church of Christ minister, and she's written the idea that she says, whenever I meet someone who has hope and I think has a lot of wisdom and character, I think that person has suffered in their life. And she says, when I experience suffering, I try to remember that suffering is the first link in a chain that is eventually going to result in things like endurance and character and hope. I don't have any answers that are really satisfying of why we humans learn our deepest spiritual lessons often through difficulty and suffering. I just know that we do. And a way to cope with our suffering is to try to practice trust that says, I'm going to grow from this. I'm going to learn from this. I am going to find hope in this. And that may not even make sense at this present moment, but to try to trust that that will occur. And this is where in Philippians 4, Paul uses the phrase, the peace that passes understanding, a type of peace that God gives that doesn't even make sense, that circumstances would seem to say that we should have no peace in this moment, but sometimes we find ourselves possessing it. And that's grace. Our time is ending, and we're dipping our toes into the deepest of waters. I want to recommend a couple of resources that I'm going to put in the study guide. But for those of you who want to pursue it on your own, one is, Janet, when I heard you speaking honestly, where you described yourself as having great faith, or maybe you had great faith and you aren't really sure where you are. That's what I heard from you, at least. And forgive me if I'm misrepresenting you.
No,
Um,
it's not gone, but it's, somewhere over here.
it's not what it was,
Right.
right? There's a
It comes
concept.
back again.
What,
Uh,
Maria?
When you're done through one difficult times and then you think you've made it and then somebody else comes up. And this is
Right.
what I experience right now. It's harder than I've ever had before. When will
Right.
it ever end? I'm 90. I've done enough. I
Yeah.
think.
I think you have two. But Maria,
Not
you're
gonna
one of
end.
those people who's always still learning, though. And it may not comfort you, but it's inspiring to me. I hope I have half of your resilience when I'm, if I make it to 90. But you may have heard of the expression, the dark night of the soul. This is a
No.
concept coined by a 16th century Spanish monk named St. John of the Cross. And he wrote a poem called The Dark Night and wrote two like hugely long commentaries that I've never been able to make it through. But there are a lot of people who have written on it in more accessible, popular ways in books. But he describes the dark night of the soul as a time that comes upon us in our journeys, often right after we've had some great spiritual moment, or we've overcome something. And then, where we have an experience of God, maybe that's powerful. And then we go into a period where God seems completely absent. And he validates that feeling. And describes it as a process we go through where all the stuff we used to do that helped us spiritually isn't meaningful anymore, and he
No, it
says
still
that,
is. It still
yeah,
is.
well, good, but he says there are times when it's not, and he describes it as a process of, and this may sound strange, of God helping us to direct our attention away from other people or the tools that are meant to help us get closer to God, and actually focus more on God, period. And I described this about, the trend in American Christianity that I see repeatedly is the people who do want to go to church anymore kind of move from church to whoever the greatest preacher they think, or whoever has the best music or show, they think. And what you discover is they get bored and they just keep moving, for the next thing to stimulate them and get them excited. And so the focus isn't really on God, it's on themselves, or it's on a celebrity preacher, or it's on a great band. And and so what I understand this process is for those of us earnestly trying to find God, is to quit focusing on the stuff that's meant to help us see God, but to actually eventually learn to experience God in a new and deeper way. And so I offer that for folks who are struggling and maybe feel like God's completely absent and the stuff that used to work doesn't work anymore, is to hang on. You're not the first to feel that way. And then very quickly, the other book is a book by a man who's not a Christian, he's Jewish. It's called Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. And he was a German, became a psychologist, psychotherapist, but he was in the Holocaust and in the death camps. If I remember right, he was in Auschwitz, but survived. And he describes that experience, and out of it says that the one final freedom we have when we experience suffering is determining what meaning we will take from it. And he
And it's
says
like-
the Nazis could never take that away from us, was our decision about what meaning we would take away from the experience and what kind of person we would be because of the experience.
Yeah, I just
And
read
he's-
it. A good book.
What's that, Maria?
I just read the book like 6 months ago.
You read that one?
Well, we own it, yes.
Yeah, yeah. So I'd recommend it to you because it's a helpful book that focuses, that doesn't pull any punches about what suffering, how bad it can be, but says we always have freedom in what meaning we take from it and how we respond in our suffering. And to me, it's a great lesson.
It's still hard.
Oh, I'm not saying it's easy. If I've come across like any of this is simple, then I'm sorry, because none of it's simple or easy. But I just point to it and say, other people with a lot more spiritual maturity and wisdom than me have experienced suffering, and yet nonetheless were able to be honest about their pain, but also discover the presence of God or discover meaning in the midst of it. And it's a mystery, but I believe it.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
So I think that has to conclude our time. If anybody has a burning question, I'll hang on for a little bit. Or if anybody thinks of something and you don't feel like you can ask it or share it, you can email Jimmy and he'll send it on to me. And we can always come back to it in next week's session.
Thank you,
So,
Chase. Thank you very much.
thank you all.
Thank you, Chase.
Thanks for coming, everybody.
So thank you, those of you who shared. I so appreciate your vulnerability and your honesty.
Great session. Thank you, Chase.
Thank you, Maureen.
Chase, what was
Yeah.
the first book you recommended? I didn't get the title.
Well, it's not a specific book, although you
Oh.
can you can actually find it under this title. It's called The Dark Night of the Soul. And you'll actually find the spiritual writings of that 16th century Spanish monk translated. But I would say I find it a little dense. And instead, you might look for titles of people who are writing about it and describing their own experience as dark nights of the soul, and see if any of those speak to you. Because I have to confess, I'm more of a second-hand reader of it, because the actual reading of the original is a little daunting. Although I've heard there's a new translation of it out that is very beautiful and much more accessible. But the ones I tried to read, it was like, oh, wow, this is, there's the original poem, and this monk wrote like 2 big books about it. And I couldn't make it through it. But I've read a lot of people who have read and have made it, presented its truths in more accessible ways. And I'll try to think of one of the books I've read that have been helpful and put that in the study guide.
Okay. See you next week. Thank you.
All right.
Thank
Thanks a
you.
lot, Chase. Always good to see you.
Boy.
I'm thinking about my journey out of the anger. I have some thoughts, but I have to put them together
Okay. Well,
because
I want to hear them.
I'm out of that. I'm not angry anymore.
Yeah.
Wow.
But I would say your anger was necessary.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. But I didn't
And-
want to be without the God of my understanding. So that God never left me. I left that God, but we're back.
Yeah. I wouldn't want to discount your experience or your interpretation. I would just push back a little bit in love and say, maybe you never left God.
Well,
That
maybe.
all of your anger, from what we see in the Bible, is itself faithfulness. leaving God would be indifference. You know, same way, maybe you and Marty have never had a fight, okay? And so this is an example that wouldn't work for your marriage, okay? Because you and Marty have never disagreed on anything ever, right, Marty? You never disagree. But Jennifer and I disagree, right? And what we have found is sometimes you need to fight. Of course, you need to try to fight fairly, but you want to express your anger. And that when you bottle it up or pretend it doesn't exist, then you end up like, you know, unfairly exploding at them sometime. But the loving thing to do is to express and say, hey, I'm angry about what you did, you know, and then to talk through it. Well, I think there's a truth there for our relationship with God that says, you know, we're angry, we feel angry, maybe with justification. And I would say death of children is if anybody has a right to be angry, it's a parent whose child has died. And pretending that you aren't angry is unhealthy and dishonest. And so expressing your anger at God is actually, according to what the Bible says, maybe the most faithful thing you can do. Because when you read those Psalms of lament, they are angry at God. And so, and I wouldn't call that moving away from God. I would say it's engaging with God. And so think about that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very